Okay, I'm back with part two of art history vocabulary, or art words, right? So we were just going to start off with space, mass, and volume. So, whoops, forgot mass on there. So let's put some mass in there. All right. So space, mass, and volume. Space is the bounded, like within a frame, right? That would be the space I have to work with, right? That's the or boundless container of objects. It could be within a frame, or it could be just out there, like infinite space. It can be the literal space occupied by the mass of a 3D sculpture. So mass occupies space, right? It takes up space. Its mass is three-dimensional. So you have a three-dimensional mass that you can walk around and see it. So I think that's a real important way to think about it. So it can be the literal space occupied by the mass of a three-dimensional sculpture, right? Or it can be contained, like, in space can be illusionistic. I'm going to write that down. Illusionistic, right? That's kind of cool. And by showing like the illusion of three dimensions in a two-dimensional space. And I think that's an important thing to really think about. That you can pretend, right, that something is three-dimensional this is a two-dimensional space, right? Like I can't put my hand through it. But if I want something to look three-dimensional, if I just drew like a square like this, right, it looks flat, right? But if I wanted to look three-dimensional, I might use some tricks, some art tricks, right, to give it the illusion of existing in three dimensions. And to do this, we use particular tools, artist tools. I'm going to do this from the side, so it's not really looking that great. But you get the idea, right? Kind of something that looks more, the illusion of having three dimensions, a three-dimensional object on a two-dimensional space, okay? So mass takes up space. That's it, okay? You need to know that, but it does not have to be solid, okay? It can be hollow inside, right? It can be empty, like a room in a house, right? Or the inside of a clay pot, okay? So it doesn't have to be solid at all. Volume is the space that the mass organizes, divides, or encloses, right? Encloses would be like the interior spaces of a house or a building. The space occupied by a three-dimensional sculpture. So volume and mass can describe both interior and exterior forms. So volume and mass can describe both the interior or the exterior of a form. And so let's talk about how we show some of this. So there are some tools we use, I just said, and they are called perspective and foreshortening. These are very important for art, especially two-dimensional art, okay? Artists use perspective to make, like I said, to make objects on a flat two-dimensional surface appear to be three-dimensional, okay? And it's kind of like to fool the eye, right? We like those things that kind of fool the eye. It makes it appear that it's real when it's really not real, obviously, right? Some paintings are called photorealism because they look so realistic that it's hard to distinguish if it's real or if it's a photograph. If it's a painting or a photograph, right? So that like photorealism can be really, really amazing, and they use perspective and foreshortening for that. Okay, so there are three main types of perspective. Three types. There are linear, right? Linear means with line. Okay, so this is a way that we use. It's called to give two-dimensional space the illusion of being three-dimensional. Right? We use linear perspective a lot, and it comes in 1, 2, and 3-point perspective. And I'm going to just give you a quick kind of demo on it because I think it's important just kind of have an idea of what that means. So 1-point perspective is where you have a vanishing point on the horizon and everything disappears into that horizon. So if I'm looking at the road, right, it goes, it disappears, you know, after at the horizon line, right? So that's just disappearing. So everything would get smaller and kind of disappear into that. So if I had trees on the side of the road, as I got further away, they would appear smaller and even maybe look like a solid line, right? So that is 1-point perspective, okay? 2-point perspective uses 2 points on the horizon line to disappear to. And I'm just going to draw this out really quick because I think it's important to kind of get an idea. You'll see a lot of times this kind of thing done. Now, real art, like actual professional artists, don't often draw these grid lines, right? They do what's called sighting. So they do it by holding up their brush or pencil and just looking at what they're looking at. And they usually close one eye, and you'll see artists do this, you know, where they're kind of closing one eye. They're doing a 2-point perspective, right? Just by knowing how to do it, right? It's not quite as accurate, but it's pretty dang close. Okay, so 2-point perspective, you're using 2 points to vanish off into, and so to make something look three-dimensional, let me just get a different color here because I think this might be a little easier to see, right? You follow those lines, except for the vertical ones, which are always going to be up and down. So when you erase the other lines, let me just make these thicker so you can see them a little better. If I were to erase these other lines, it makes it look like I have a building or a box in 3 dimensions, okay, on this 2-dimensional surface, right? You can see 3 sides of it. It looks natural, doesn't it? And so that is 2-point perspective. 3-point perspective adds an extra point. In this case, it might be depending on whether you're looking at it from the top or the bottom. But let's just take a quick look at how that might look if I added an extra point down here and I use lines, vertical lines. And this is the only time that it's going to be different is if I use these vertical lines here. And now I'm going to have my building look more like this. And this is what it would be looking like if I were looking at it from a bird's eye view, right? Looking down from the top, it looks bigger, and then down to the bottom where it's smaller. So let's just cut that off. So in other words, that would be how it would look if I was looking, cruising around with a drone, maybe, okay? Kind of make a difference there. So that one is 3-point perspective, okay? So you have 3 points that you're vanishing into. So perspective makes makes a 2-dimensional surface appear 3-dimensional, and that's really important. So the next kind of perspective, so this was linear perspective. So let's erase these little things. We'll leave linear up there. The first one is linear. The next one is intellectual. So intellectual perspective, you guys, basically means things overlapping. So if I were to draw, oops, let me do it this way. Hang on. If I were to draw some shapes and I drew them like this, which one would be closest? The one in front, right? Is it really closer? Because it's a flat surface, they're all the same distance, aren't they? But our brain tells us, right, our intellect tells us that if something is hidden behind something else, it's further away, right? So this would be closest, that would be middle, that would be the furthest, okay? Intellectual perspective sometimes also works with size, not just overlapping, but size. If we see something smaller, we assume that it's further away. So, right, we assume that this is closer, that's next, and that one's further away. Also, where it is on the actual composition. Sometimes for humans, we think that if it's down low, it's closer, and the next, and then the next, right? So that would be further away of that. But those are all considered intellectual perspective. And the final type of perspective, you guys, is atmospheric. An atmospheric perspective basically refers to how artists show something as far away with color and light. And so in real life, when something's very far away, such as a mountain, it'll appear kind of bluish or violet, and it will look very faded, right? We don't see the detail with something that's really far away, right? It looks maybe a little fuzzy because, well, it's far away, right? We can't see that far. We can see the shape of it, and because there's so much atmosphere in between something that's really far away, such as a mountain, and us, right, it'll appear kind of bluish or violet color, like, you know, Purple Mountain's Majesty, right? Next time you take a look at the color of mountains when you're really far away. They'll look kind of like a faded blue jean color, or a very faded like violet or purplish color, or hue, right? That's a vocabulary. So with that in mind, that is where atmospheric perspective comes in, where an artist uses that tool, that device, to make something appear like it's very far away, even if it's on a flat surface, okay? And that's an actual fact. The atmosphere turns stuff bluish when you look at it through a lot of it. Just as a kind of a heads up, like if we're looking at a mountain, right, and you're standing over here, and you're looking across all this atmosphere at the mountain, that's a lot of atmosphere. And just as a heads up, because I think a lot of people don't understand this, but it's very important to know with light, the gases in our atmosphere refract ultraviolet light. And so that bounces all around in the atmosphere. We can't see it bouncing around, but it's there, okay? So it refracts it, so that, and that's that particular combination of gases in our atmosphere that makes it, you know, good for us to breathe, right? And good for all the life on Earth, is what gives our sky that blue color, okay? It's because the ultraviolet light is bouncing all around in the atmosphere, in the sky. And so looking through a whole lot of it will give whatever's far away that kind of bluish tinge or bluish color. And just as a heads up, the ocean looks blue because it's reflecting the sky, okay? Sky does not reflect anything, right? If it's gas, it does refract light, right? Gas can refract light, but it's not reflecting anything. Okay, so when you see, like, you know, the ocean looks blue or water looks blue, is water really blue? No. If water was blue, right, you wouldn't be drinking it. Okay, it would look like it was something funky was wrong with it, like the tidy bowl man had been, you know, scooped out at some toilet water or something, right? So no, water's clear, but it does reflect. It has reflective properties, so it can reflect light back, and if what's reflecting back is the sky, it's going to look blue. So that's where you get that atmospheric perspective from. Okay, so the foreshortening, and let's erase the perspectives here, but let's talk about foreshortening for just a minute. So foreshortening, you guys, refers to depicting human bodies or animal bodies at an angle to the flat surface that they're painted on, okay? Or maybe even sculpted on, right? They call it the picture plane, okay? So when we're looking at that, we say that it's the picture plane or the plane. The plane is the flat surface, okay? So if you have a body that's at a right angle to that surface, you'll see it foreshortened, right? Or a body part will look foreshortened. In other words, if I had my hand, right? I'm not going to do a really fancy drawing here, right? Standing out like that, it would look much bigger. And the arm would be going back that way to a person that looked much smaller, right? So I'm putting my hand out. Let's say here's the person, right? And they're going like that. So if I do that to this camera right now, if I go like this to the camera, my hand's going to appear really large and my body's going to look smaller, right? That's foreshortening. So that would be at the right angle to the picture plane. Okay, so the picture plane is the flat surface that paintings are put on. So it's a way to kind of show linear perspective, right, with human bodies as opposed to buildings. It looks natural, just as our eyes see it, right? To use foreshortening and perspective. And how our brain interprets the world around us when we see it, how the information is interpreted. So foreshortening and perspective are what help us what helps things to look real when we're looking at artworks and paintings. Okay, so let's talk about another couple of words that are important in art, and those are proportion and scale. Okay, so proportion describes the relationship of objects or subjects, okay, within the composition, right? So how the relationship within a composition. So if this was a painting, the relationship of the objects or subjects within the composition of the artwork, or parts of the said subjects with each other. Right, so how they're proportioned with each other. Although we may not consciously know why, okay, we intuitively, from our right brain, because that's where we see relationships, right, spatial relationships, we understand when things look, quote, out of proportion. Okay, so that's an important thing in art. We use what we call a basic unit of measure, right? Or a module. A lot of artists just call it a basic unit. Right? But it's a basic unit of measure. And what that means is we use it to compare the artwork or the composition. So sometimes you'll see in the movies, you'll see artists or photographers, painters doing something like this, where you see them holding a pen or a pencil or a paintbrush, and they've got their thumb on it, and they're closing one eye, and they're kind of looking at, and they're measuring. You can see them kind of measuring with their thumb, like how big something is, right? And then they're comparing it to something else. So they're comparing a basic unit of measure, which, I mean, it could be, say, one thing in the composition you're comparing all the rest to, okay? And that could be like the size of a hand, the width of a chair, the height of a door. You're taking that, or a window, you're taking that unit of measurement, you're measuring it, and then you're comparing it to something else that should be about the same size, right? To make sure that it's in proportion. We've all seen drawings and paintings where there's a really big head. It's not in proportion to the little tiny body. Okay, so that's what proportion means. So there's been like a lot of over the years. There have been many what we call ideals in art, in the proportions of art, like kind of like rules. Or methods or systems of correct measurement, right? We'll put correct measurement. These are often called ideals or canons, like the ideal proportion. Whoops. Right. So it's a canon of art, or a system or a method to measure. They've been invented over the millennia and used over many millennia, and you can look them up, right? We're not going to go into a lot of detail on that. Just understand that proportion refers to the relationships of objects or subjects, the size relationships, okay? That's an important thing to know. And then as far as scale goes, scale is kind of a similar thing. It refers to what size it is. What's the scale? So scale can be large scale, right? Or it could be small. So let's give an example of a large scale artwork. So we all know the size of a hat, right? Hats fit on our head. Right? That's the scale of a regular size hat. If we look at the Salinas rodeo grounds right next to them at Sherwood Park, there's 3 big giant hats. They are on a very large scale, right? We know that no one wears a hat that big, so it's too big to fit on someone's head. It would be a large scale sculpture, right? Kind of out of proportion to a regular size hat or head. But it does make a statement. So a lot of times artists will use scale to show the importance of something. So they can make one thing larger, a larger scale, right? Larger size to show its importance. So you'll often find there's kind of the hierarchical scale, and they say that in art a lot, to where artists, especially in ancient times, Egyptians were good at this, right? The biggest figure is the most important figure, so they're using scale to show the importance of something. In the Hat and 3 Stages of Landing sculpture by Claes Oldenburg and Kosha van Bruggen, that uses scale of a large scale to show or to declare the importance of something that is like an everyday object, like a hat, can be shown to be more important and more special by being so large. So that's just one example that we can see from from where we are at. Now, there's a few more words in our vocabulary that I'd like to tell you. We'll kind of try to get through them as quickly as possible. I know this isn't the most exciting part of art history, but it's important to know this vocabulary. So carving and casting, let's talk about that. carving and casting is normally done for sculpture, and it's normally sculpture or jewelry, which, you know, jewelry is kind of a sculpture in itself. Um, and normally with three-dimensional pieces, right? With 3D in the round type sculpture. Sculpture is often, let's only write that down. Let me put sculpture here because that's what we're mostly talking about, okay? It can be additive or subtractive. What does that mean? Well, what it means is if you're taking a piece of rock or wood and carving away from it, right? Carving things off, you're subtracting from that material, from that medium. If you're welding things together or gluing them together somehow, sticking them together, it's additive. You're adding things, right? You're adding pieces to a piece. It's exactly what it sounds like. You're either subtracting it away or you're adding to it. Okay, that makes sense to everyone. A lot of times sculpture, especially very large ones, uses something called an armature. So an armature is basically a skeleton. Right? It helps hold it together, just like our skeleton holds our body up, you know, so we're not all flopping around like a squid or something, right? Or jellyfish. An armature can hold a large sculpture up, and it's usually kind of on the inside. When we're doing casting is where we have a hollow form that's filled with another material such as metal, right, or liquid clay. In recent years, you know, of course, we have like polymer and other kinds of things that we can use to cast with. Generally, we have a hollow form that's filled with something else that we can use over and over again, right? So you have something that you can make multiples of when you have a form. So normally you use a mold, right, which is a hollow form. Okay, for casting. So relief sculpture, there's another type of sculpture, right, called relief sculpture. Okay, relief sculpture is basically, well, it's the difference is, so a regular sculpture would be called in the round, right? So that is a regular sculpture. In the round means that you can actually walk around it, right? It's sculpted on all sides. It looks like it's a three-dimensional thing, whatever. It has three dimensions. It exists, has mass and takes up space in three dimensions, okay? Relief sculpture is not freestanding, right? So an in the round sculpture is a freestanding sculpture that you can walk around. It's like, you know, it's three-dimensional. It's freestanding, okay? Relief sculpture is usually attached to a wall or a building of some sort. In other words, it's relieved off the wall. So it's usually a subtractive method, okay? What it means is that it projects off the building a little bit, right? There's both high relief sculpture. Sometimes these are called like a frieze. And there's low relief. And that is called BAS, but it's spelled B-A-S. So you'll often see, so low relief is called bas relief in art. And you'll often hear people say that. And bas relief is a low relief. In other words, it doesn't stick out much, okay? High relief, the subjects will be sticking out quite a bit from the surface that they are sculpted on, okay? So in other words, if this was a surface that was a sculpture and I had an arm sticking out, it might be sticking out pretty far, you know, like this. With bas relief, it's very low. There's some relief, but you can see some shape and some form, but it's not sticking out a whole bunch. So an example of bas relief would be a coin, right? It's pretty smooth, right? But there is a little bit of sculpture there, right? So that would be a low relief or bas relief sculpture, okay? So that's carving and casting. So carving would be something that you would do to take away, right? And that would be subtractive, right? If you're carving, you're taking things away. And casting would be more additive, okay? That kind of gives you a little bit of an idea with that. And then finally, we're going to talk just briefly about architectural architecture. So when we're talking about architecture in art history, we often are looking at diagrams of buildings, okay? A plan is basically a map of the floor. That's it. This is the map of the floor. Other words that they use are called, would be a section. So these are all to describe buildings. So a section is like a slice through a building, okay? If it's a lateral slice, it would be the width. If it's a longitudinal slice, it would be the length, okay? So it gives you kind of an idea of that. So there's sections. Also, so a section is just like a slice through the middle of the building. Like if you could just slice something in half, you could see like that section. And then also elevation is like a map of the vertical part of the building. So instead of the floor, it's a map of the vertical. So you're seeing it like, say, from the side or from the front. I'm going to say map of the walls because that's kind of what it is. You're looking at it like that way as opposed to looking at it from up above, right, from overhead. So when you're looking at a plan, you're looking at it from the floor, like the floor, the map of the floor. You're looking at it from overhead. When you're looking at the elevation, you're looking at it from the point of view as if you were standing there actually looking at the building. So these are all terms we're going to be using when we're discussing in our class discussions. We're going to be using these terms when we're talking about art and art history, okay? So it's important for you guys to know them. Thank you for bearing with me with this long vocabulary lecture in 2 parts, and we'll see you next time in class.